Welcome to the Fine Print, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, Caleb Teskey, coming at you with another fantastic guest tonight. And as usual, we're gonna do the usuals off the top. We're gonna thank some of my previous guests, Nate Renmis, Ethan Sumner. If you haven't checked out any of his music, I encourage you all to go do that. It's a fantastic artist spotlight interview that I did was it yesterday, the night before? Stephen Houghton, cultivator from New York, CNY hemp processing, real life botanicals, box guts. Please check out his music too. And Nancy Wallace down in Oklahoma. Rob Skure here, who just dropped his new album, Water. Great stuff going on. And I want to announce a couple things I got coming up too. On Tuesday this week, on the 30th, I got Brad Racino coming back. If you guys didn't see my first interview with Brad, New York Cannabis Insider. He's one of the top journalists I've really encountered here in the country. Then February 1st, I got Keith Stroop, who's the founder of Normal, coming on the show. I think that's going to be a fantastic interview. And then on I skipped a month. Yep. Then on Sunday the 4th, I got Gina Tron coming on. If you guys don't know about Gina Tron, Google her name. You'll find out all about it. And then hopefully on Tuesday the 6th, I've got a follow-up with Antoine Mordican, who just got a license down in Alabama. So a bunch of great guests coming up and great guests I've had. And tonight we got another good one. And you guys know that I really love talking about science with the scientists in the cannabis industry. Tonight from Craig Corporate Advantage, Wham Bam, it's Dr. Carl Craig. Carl, thank you for being here with me tonight, man.
Hey, thanks, Caleb. It'll be fun.
Yep. And before we do anything serious, will you give us a 5-minute life story?
Man, give a chemist an audience 5 minutes just doesn't work, man. We go on forever. No, I appreciate it.
Take 20. I don't give a shit. You do your life story at your own pace, please.
That's how you know it's a chemist, because they get up on stage and they ramble. So I'm going to try not to do that. 5-minute life story. So started out my life in Montana, and my mom hated the cold, so we moved to Arizona. That was kind of a flip-flop, right? You go from one of the coldest places on earth to one of the warmer places. Lived in Tucson for middle school and high school. I'm a cold weather guy. I live in Denver. I went to undergraduate up at NAU, which is in Arizona, but it's up at 7,000 feet. They have ski area and the Lowell Observatory, which is famous for discovering Pluto. Anyway, went to undergraduate school there. At that point, I was thinking about med school or science. I wasn't quite sure. Now I'm going to say this, and I hope I don't offend too many people in your audience, and that is the med school folks that were destined to go, they were not my kind of peeps. I mean, man, I just couldn't hang out with those folks. They were really bright and a lot of cool things, but I like the science people better. So I ended up applying to graduate school to get a Ph.D. in chemistry. I picked lifestyle places: Colorado, University of Washington, and University of California at Santa Barbara. And fortunately, I got to choose. And well, I chose Santa Barbara. Not a bad place to have to get to if you're going to get a PhD. So I studied there. My PhD was the idea of taking energy from the sun and making fuels from it. Now, solar energy now is all photovoltaics, but what we were trying to do is use the sun's energy with some catalysts and heavy metals, things like that, to maybe turn cheap materials into fuels. Didn't work. Still hasn't worked. It's an idea. It's a great plan, and hopefully we can get there someday. But we weren't there. So got my PhD doing that, and then had the opportunity to postdoc. Now, postdoc just means I wasn't ready to get a job yet. So I went up and postdoced at Berkeley, just up the road, with a guy by the name of Melvin Calvin. And Melvin is famous for, and it's interesting to be talking to people in the cannabis industry now because he won the Nobel Prize in 1961 for the photosynthetic cycle. And if you really rack your brain and you think back, they called it the Calvin cycle. And it's fascinating how that all came about. And if you want to talk about it, I will, because it really is sort of an interesting uh, portal into the way science really works. So, at any rate, he won the Nobel Prize.
I do want to talk about it here. Hold up. Let me put you in the big box. Yeah. And that was definitely in my notes here. And I was hoping you would give us some of the details of that because that sounded fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. I'll backtrack to that in just a second. I finished up that postdoc, went into the kind of research side, which is what chemists are supposed to do when you got a PhD. And I really wasn't great at it. I love the science, but I wasn't good as a researcher, really. So from then on, really was on the business side of science and have spent time with some really cool scientific companies, but more in the leadership role. And that's been just a whole bunch of fun.
So what was will you just give us a little taste of the photosynthetic cycle? Because I'm sure for you, those words are just like second nature, but for other people watching this, that might not mean anything. And for me, I'd really love to know the details of what you guys were looking into there on that project.
Yeah. So I'll tell you what we were doing when I got there. He won the Nobel Prize in 1961. I'm not old enough to have been part of that group, thank goodness. But yeah, but it's interesting to be talking to people in the cannabis industry where photosynthesis is absolutely critical. So how did that come about? Well, it's fascinating because Melvin was a associate professor at Berkeley, and his mentor was a guy by the name of Gilbert Newton Lewis, GN Lewis. Now, anybody who has taken freshman chemistry has heard about Lewis acids and bases. He was also a Nobel laureate and really revolutionized chemistry back in sort of the early part of the 20th century. Melvin worked for him, and this is how science really works. I love telling this story because there's so many people that think science is really pre-programmed, and you sit down and you come up with a hypothesis and you do this. Here's how it really worked. So Lewis was a big cigar smoker, and they were standing up at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, which was the government-run um, lab that used particle accelerators to study particle physics. Now they had these neutron beams that would flash out over the bay because you don't want them to hit people. Neutrons are pretty harmful to people. And to try and slow the neutrons down, they ran it through a 4 foot wide moat of water that had concrete on both sides. And one day, Lewis is up there, he's smoking a cigar. It's outside, and the particle accelerator is under a big canopy, but they had to open it up because they didn't have air conditioning. So he looks at Melvin and he says, "I wonder what's in that water." And he walks over, he grabs a coffee cup, he tapes it to a stick, he reaches down, gets on a ladder, reaches down, pulls up a bunch of gunk out of the bottom of this moat, and then hands it to Calvin and says, "Go figure out what's in there." And to make long story short, what Calvin did, he spent a fair bit of time to try and figure it out. What he found out was there were a lot of precipitated carbonates that were in the bottom of that moat. But what was interesting about them was that they were radioactive. So instead of being carbon 12, which is the neutral form of carbon that we find in our atmosphere all the time, a lot of them were carbon 14, which are radioactive. They give off an electron. They decay by giving off an electron. So now Melvin says, I figured it out. This is what it is. And Lewis is like, yeah, so what? Now what are you going to do with it? And he's like, oh, now I got to go back in the lab. I thought I had it. I thought I figured it out. Um,
Huh.
so I won't bore you about what happened in between,
No,
but
you're not gonna fucking bore me, Carl. This is why I brought you on the show, man.
so Calvin literally, I mean, he's like, what am I going to do with this stuff? Now he's working for G.N. Lewis, the father of Lewis acids and bases. And it's at one point, Lewis looks at me and goes, you know, if you add some acid to those bicarbonates and carbonates, it's going to give off CO2, and the CO2 is going to be radioactive. So Calvin's like, okay, cool. So he developed a series of detectors where he could do that. He could acidify the stuff that he had, and he would see CO2 come off, and it was hot. It was high in carbon 14. And then he's like, well, what do I do with that? And long story short, he started to grow plants in an environment where the CO2 that they took in, because everybody at that point knew that plants fix CO2 for their energy, now he has plants that are taking in CO2 that's radioactive. So he can now take a look at where that carbon 14 went, and in studying that, discovered the entire photosynthetic cycle and how CO2 combines with other parts of the plant and what they fix to make energy, and won the Nobel Prize for figuring that out.
Huh. All right. Shameless slap. And I'm going to do this every like 10 or 15 minutes, but Carl Craig, Corporate Advantage. Dr. Carl, I don't know if you like to be called doctor, but anyone with a PhD, I slap a little doctor for you on there.
I'll, I'll, I'll tell you, the only person that called me doctor was my mom. She was so proud of it. But
Well,
other than that, I'm Carl. I'm just telling you.
you can call me mom, Carl.
There you go. All right.
So the next thing I want to ask you about is something that I think we spoke about on the phone, which was dioxin testing. And that was something I've been also looking into a lot of environmental issues here in Vermont, including PFAS contamination in our water. And the dioxin stuff, I've seen a bunch of lawsuits about water wells being contaminated. I'd love to hear about that a little bit, please.
Sure. And you know what? I'll tie it back a little bit to the cannabis industry because there is a parallel here. So dioxin analysis kind of became a big thing in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And at that time, you had to have a very expensive high resolution mass spectrometer to even see this stuff. And most of the analysis for environmental contaminants were done on a GC, and it might cost you $100 to get a result. Dioxin analysis was closer to $1,000 to $1,500. And the reason for that was one, the equipment was very expensive. Two, the prep to get the dioxin in a place where you could then analyze it was also very expensive. You had to have special rooms, all kinds of stuff.
Why did you have to have special rooms? Sorry to cut you off, but I got to slip that question in there.
Yeah, no, partially because there are a lot of things that will interfere, not necessarily dioxins, but other things that will interfere with the signal that you're going to get off that high resolution mass spec. And so if you have those, it will mask your signal.
What types of things? What types of things would interfere with that signal?
Oh, you're punching over my pay grade because I don't remember.
Well,
Uh,
shit.
but no, it's all good. But here I will. This is the kind of story. All right, this is the kind of stuff. This one I know very well. There are other detectors that are very, very sensitive. And back in the UK, they were developing this new detector called a ELCD detector, and it was supposed to be very sensitive. The chemist who was working on it, a guy by the name of Green, he kept trying to clean the detector up, and he just saw a flat line, and he was like, "Why isn't it detecting anything? I don't understand." And this went on for months. And this was in the 70s. So one day he gets his instrument all cleaned up, and it starts to show little signals. And guess what? At that time, as Caleb smoking. People could smoke cigarettes. Yeah, it's all good, but people could smoke cigarettes outside the lab, not in the lab, but right at the door, right? So this guy walks by and he's smoking a cigarette, and all of a sudden, Green sees this huge peak come up and level out. It took hours to come back down. So the deal was that some of the particulate and other things that were in the cigarette smoke were actually saturating the detector so you couldn't see the things you were looking to see. Dioxin is very similar to that.
Oh, interesting. And this isn't a cigarette.
No, I know.
Just for the record. Yeah.
I just said smoking. I didn't say what.
Wow.
But the thing about PFAS is I mean, they're similar, right? I mean, in some ways structurally similar.
Are
And
they similar? I don't know that. Is that true?
yeah, and they're similarly difficult to detect and do a good job of detecting. Now, what I want to do here is I'm going to throw this out for your group because this is what is interesting and important. California recently adopted prescriptive methods, right? So now every lab has to perform the same method the same way, and that's how they're going to try and get uniform data and quit the lab shopping and all that sort of stuff.
I saw that, and I saw this story. I think Josh Swider sent that to me, and Josh has been on the show from Infinite Chemical Analysis Labs, and yeah, and I know they've been having a ton of problems out there with the potency inflation and different types of lab shenanigans.
Yeah. So here's what I want to say, just sort of general education for the group, is that so there are these two ways to do analytical measurement. One is prescriptive, and that is what California is doing, saying you've got to do this. You do A, B, and C. Clinical work in the medical community is the same way. And I'll explain that in a second. Dioxins and PFASs and things that are on the cutting edge are performance-based methods. And what that means is you need scientists who can dig in and really optimize the methods to be able to see this stuff. And it's not easy to do. And what you end up with is people who say, hey, I've got the best method. And somebody else goes, no, I got the best method. And one of the difficulties there is comparing the data across both methods. And that's sort of the reason that people go to prescriptive methods. Now, let me tell you about prescriptive methods. It sounds great, right? We're going to stop doing lab shopping. We're going to stop all the shenanigans. Well, no. I'll give you two examples of prescriptive methods and why they're used. In the contract lab program, which, speaking about dioxins and contamination, environmental pollution, the contract lab program was invented to study Superfund sites, right? Burning rivers, burning lakes, things that are buried underground that shouldn't be. And so the government who reviewed all this data wanted to be able to review the data from a lab in California and a lab in Maine and be able to compare the data. Compare it. They didn't really care if it was all that accurate. They just wanted it to be comparable. That way, if you had a Superfund site in Maine and you had a Superfund site in California, you were cleaning them up to the same performance by comparing the methods, even though it might not be the best method. It might not even be that accurate. I'm going to give you another example, and this one, I won't say should scare you, but it should enlighten you. In the medical,
I'd love to be scared. Go
all right,
ahead.
Here
Go
we
ahead,
go.
Carl.
I'll bring it, man. I'll bring it. So years ago, there was a lawsuit in California that went over this. You can dig this stuff up, but vitamin D analysis. How much vitamin D do we have in our blood, right? And there's a lot that gets talked about vitamin D, what it does for you, what it doesn't do for you, all that kind of stuff. And clinicians have said, you know, it's a deficit of vitamin C can lead to a broad variety of conditions. Well, we did some work long ago at a company that I was at and found that the current methods that are used by doctors to determine how much vitamin C is in your blood, we're low by at least a factor of 2 and often a factor of 4.
So
So
they were doing vitamin C deflation.
vitamin D deflation.
D. Okay. Yeah. Cool. All right. Interesting. Yeah. Carry
So,
on.
but here's the thing. We came to the organizations that developed these methods, and we said, hey, we got a better method for you. It's more accurate. It gives you, you know, 4 times higher results. The docs can see what it really is, and it'll be accurate. And you know what they said? We don't care.
Fuck yourself. I was gonna say fuck yourself, but yeah.
They were a little more polite, but the thing is, all they want to be able to do is compare the results, right? They just want to say, I know how to treat people with these levels. I don't care if they're as accurate as can be. I just need them to be reproducible and reliable. That's what prescriptive methods do. They give you a result that you can compare amongst other laboratories, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right result, doesn't mean it's the best result.
Yo, and let me just cut you off for a second. We got a comment here from Good People Gardens. Sounds about right. Thanks for tuning in, Good People Gardens. I appreciate your time, man. And I think this is a good transition. And here I'm just gonna slap, hey, Craig Corporate Advantage, Dr. Carl Craig, even though I'm not supposed to say that, but
Okay,
uh,
mom.
yeah, I'm gonna be your mom for the rest of the show here. So I think really the thing that caught my attention when we were speaking on the phone was this idea of scientific measurements. And I think I'd like that to be a big chunk. I hope you talk about this for like 20 minutes, but like, the idea of uh, comparing and contrasting, or like, these different types of ways that we get measurements. And I think you just touched on it a second ago, but I'm going to let you take this from here because this is a little over my head. But yeah, please go, Carl.
All right. Yeah, no, this is one of my favorite things. And so you're going to have to like throw down the mat when it's time to stop, I think.
I will.
Um,
I will. I'll rein you back in if I need to. Yeah,
all
please.
right. So I'm going to start by, and I'm not going to pick on, but I'm going to point out engineers. All right. Engineers love numbers. So if somebody puts out a certificate of analysis that says you have 21.3% delta 9 THC, guess what an engineer said? That's 21.3% THC. Chemists don't think that way. And therein lies a little bit of the problem. I'll say this a lot of times until it sinks in. We don't count molecules. We don't. There's no way to do that. If we counted molecules, then that number, 21.3 or 21.9, could be that accurate. But we can't count molecules. So the comparison I give is this. We count money. When you take 1,000 $1 bills to the bank, they count it over, they count it again, and they make sure it's 1,000, and then that goes into your bank account. The way scientists would do that, because we have no ability to count molecules, and let's just assume all 1,000 of those $1 bills are a molecule. Yep.
Why don't you have any ability to count molecules?
Well, because they're just too small. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. And we can't get down to the atomic level to measure things that are that small. We just can't. You
Well,
can.
sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, but carry on. Yeah.
No, if we could, it would be awesome. What we're measuring is I mean, let's think about it. If we put 10 microliters in an instrument, we have millions and millions and millions and millions of molecules in that 3 microliters. So to pull them apart and identify them and count them, Just doesn't happen. At least not yet. Maybe somebody will figure out how to do that.
Hmm. And
What's
we
what's
got another comment. Hold up.
what?
Oh, will AI change that? I know.
Um, that's a great question. I think that the issue is more physical than it is sort of intellectual that AI could help with. And what I mean by that is to introduce something into an analyzer, you introduce a huge amount from a molecular level. So if you could separate it out, then potentially measure it, um, possibly. And people do some of that with particles. So, for example, they'll take and aspirate a bunch of particles and shoot a laser at it and try and count how many particles that you saw. But a particle could be millions of molecules. So we're getting there. I mean, we're moving closer, but we're not there. I think AI will help because it can help uh, grind the data and look at patterns in the data, but we still have to have the kind of detectors that will be able to see that stuff. Um, so, how do scientists do this? Instead of counting $1,001 bills, what we do is we make an estimate. How do we make an estimate? Well, somebody spent a lot of time putting together a stack of bills, and they said, to the best we can tell, that's 1,000. To the best we can tell, there's an error around that. Let's say the error is 2%, right? So we've got an error of 20 bills on the high side, 20 bills on the low side, but that's the best we can do. I'm going to give you this stack of bills with some amount of error in them because I can't count them. I did my best to detect them with the technology I have. So now I have this stack, and I'm gonna say it's my reference material stack of bills. And the way I'm going to measure going forward is I'm going to take a bunch of bills, I'm going to put them on the desk, and I'm going to put these two stacks together. And when they look like they're about the same height, I'm going to say that's 1,000. Another way to do it, I'll weigh that first reference stack, which, by the way, remember, plus or minus $20 is my $1,000 standard. And maybe I weigh it, and then I weigh bills and I get them close. Scientific measurement is an estimate. It's all it can be. It's not counting. We don't count, we estimate. The same is true for weights and measures. If we knew how many atoms of uh, gold were in a specific ingot based on its atomic weight, I could tell you what the weight would be, but we can't tell how many atoms are gold are in that ingot. So we have to estimate it. That's true for all scientific measurement. Now, if you believe me that it's an estimate and not a count, then how the heck do I know it's 21.3%? Well, actually, I don't. And that's why I kind of make fun of engineers because they go, hey, it's 21.3. And when I started talking to Caleb about this, I said, the only thing I can tell you is it's not. It's not 21.
And so in Vermont, if I'm not mistaken, the margin of error for flour is 20%. So, if you've got flour that's, 20%, you could have something that says, wait, it was 25, 20% of that is 4. So you could have something that's at 24%, right? And still
or
be
or
16.
or 16.
Right. So, that seems like a pretty wide gap there, and it kind of begs the question, and also I think THC percentage is just ridiculously overrated. But I really love this argument you make that we're not like counting, we're like comparing. I've never heard anyone make that argument before, and that was super compelling to me.
Yeah, I mean, so when we analyze, let's say we've got a solution, it's got terpenes in it and cannabinoids in it. When we analyze that, what we're doing is we first inject in the instrument a standard, or what's really called a reference material. Standard is a bad term for it. Reference material is the right term. And that reference material came from a group who has been certified to be able to produce that reference material to a certain level of accuracy. But guess what? The reference material comes to you, and if you look at the C of A for that, it's got a margin of error. The best standard or reference material that I can get's got a margin of error. So right away, I can't tell you that it's 21.3. It's going to be something close to that based on the fact that my calibration solution has some error.
So you're going to get material that has a margin of error, and you're going to test it, and then there's going to be a different margin of error within your results. Is that accurate?
Yep. Well, and now let's keep going.
Wow.
I have 5 different analysts in my lab, and they're all following the same SOP. But do you think they get exactly the same results, every one of them? I don't. You can do as close as you can, but the reality is humans introduce some uncertainty to the process.
You
The
did.
other,
You
go
did my
ahead.
no. You did my segue for me, but finish your point. I got the next note coming here. Yeah.
But the other thing is, instruments are not exactly the same. I mean, you can buy the same model and do all that stuff, but at the end of the day, they're not identical. They don't give you identical results. So here's the reality of what happens when we estimate a value. There are errors that get introduced all the way along the value chain, all right? From the reference materials we buy and use to the way we dilute those reference materials up, because none of them are ready to go in the instrument. I've got to dilute them. And guess what? Everybody who dilutes them is going to add a little bit of error to that. Now, I've got 5 different instruments, and they're not the same. So I've got different error that comes from each of those instruments. I have 5 different people, and they're doing things, they're following the same SOP, but they're not exactly the same. So they're introducing error.
That's
So
and you
what
yeah, you got me there, Carl. That was the whole thing I was going to do next, was about the people prepping the samples, the people running them, the uh, gear that you're using. It seems like the chain of custody involves a lot of places where something could go wrong, or the sample could get contaminated, or I don't know who's collecting samples either. In some states, people collect their own samples and they cherry pick, I think, and naturally so, because higher THC stuff is selling better. But you know um it does seem like there's a lot of things that could go wrong in the process, from when weed is harvested to when it gets to the lab to get tested, and
so
then during the test.
Caleb, you bring up a great point, but I here's what I want to say. I want to break those two things apart. Error or mistakes or things that can cause inaccurate results are one thing. Measurement uncertainty, if everybody's doing it perfect, is the amount of uncertainty in the result, not error. Error is the wrong word. It's not an error. I did the best I could. I diluted the reference material correctly. I prepped it correctly. We went out to the field and sampled it correctly. But guess what? In the morning, my lab is 70 degrees, and in the afternoon, it's 85 degrees. And the instruments behave differently. I still am doing everything right. There's no error here. But what I'm saying is my estimate of the result has error bars around it, right? They call them error bars, but it's really the measurement uncertainty. And I will tell you at Agricor and Botanacor, so you mentioned it. Go.
Is that the confidence interval?
Mhm. Well, yes, they're tied together. The confidence interval is the measurement uncertainty at the confidence interval. So, for example, I'm going to step back real quickly. I said there are all these places where uncertainty gets introduced, where you sample the people that prep it, do all that kind of stuff, right? So, what a lab has to do is add all of those bits of uncertainty together. And then they say, okay, here's what I've got. And by the way, this is a mathematical nightmare. It really is kind of a hard thing to do. But you say, okay, here's all of the errors added in quadrature all the way along. It's this big. Then the confidence interval would be, I want to know that my result is correct with it 95% confidence. Okay. So what that tends to, or what it is statistically, is you take all of the error that the lab put together and the sampling error and all that sort of stuff, and then you multiply it by 1.97. People round it to 2, but it's 1.97. And that is the 95% confidence interval that the result that I give you is within that uncertainty. So think about this. I've added up all the uncertainties of having different people in different times, and different temperatures, different days, and sampling differently and moving these samples around. And there is uncertainty with each part of that, some level of uncertainty. I've added it all up. Now I multiply it by 2. And I am telling you that when I report 21.3 for Delta 9 with a 95% confidence interval, it's going to be between those two values. Now, you said 20%. So
Yeah.
that means somewhere between 16 and 24 is the right answer.
And I want to drop this comment from Good People Gardens again. He said 10%, I think. And I believe in Vermont, 10% is for concentrates. I believe the margin of error for flour is 20%. And if I'm wrong about that, Owen, hit me up later and we can chat about it. Yeah.
So what I'll say, and I don't know Vermont, what I'll say in Colorado is that they make the laboratory go through and calculate this, and there are ways to do it. And you have to introduce all of the possible uncertainties that could happen. For example, you have to run the same sample on different instruments on different days with different people, and from that you will figure out what is the real uncertainty. And for us at Agricor, the laboratory I ran, we worked really hard at it, and we got it to be about 8%, plus or minus 8%. But we worked really hard at it. So now, and let's just round that to 10%. So in our 20% flour, right, it's plus or minus 2. So now it's somewhere between 18 and 22%. Now here's, and I'm what I say all the time when people are like, oh, well, this 21% flour is better than the 20%. I'm like, they're the same. No, they're not. It says 21. This is 20. I'm like, I am telling you they're the same. Because with the confidence interval that we have, there is no way that you can say this is 21 and this is 20. It's just not possible. Could we do that is a great question. Could we say definitively that this is 21 and this is 20? Sure.
I'd love to see a blind taste test of people that try to smoke that weed and tell the difference. I don't think anyone would notice, personally.
No, and one of the things that I would love to do or love to see is that if people could understand this level of uncertainty, and that is to say that within the 95% confidence interval, like you said, Caleb, we know that with 95% confidence, it's between here and here. Now, quit worrying about whether it's 21 or 20, because you don't know. You actually don't know. Let's go on to the other things. What's the terpene profile? What are the, synergistic effects? Let's talk about that.
Well, what about those measurements as well? Because I've seen some products with terpene counts that looked kind of, come on. There's no way it's that much. But also, I assume the same issues with measuring terpenes is, the same issues you have measuring THC or any other, property that you're trying to measure.
Every measurement, right? Like I take you back to we're estimating. And so if you're estimating, there's got to be some uncertainty, and that uncertainty is going to be wider in some cases, narrower in some cases, but it's an uncertainty for sure.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I'm going to drop this comment from Shauna D'Amatos. Hey, Shauna, I don't know if it really matters anyway. Do you guys think besides the tax aspect, it would actually hold bearing? Shauna, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but I would like to ask you to clarify, and thank you for tuning in. I'm always glad to have your support here, and Shauna's coming on the show soon, but I'm not sure what you mean there, Shauna. But if you clarify, I'll read the next comment. Carl, and here we're going to do another shameless slab. Dr. Carl Craig Corporate Advantage. Do you want to tell us about Craig Corporate Advantage for a second before I go to the next stuff?
Sure. So I was saying that I was managing as a CEO marijuana lab here in Colorado and a hemp testing lab. But when I'm not doing that, I have a consulting company, Craig Corporate Advantage, and I really love using good science to help companies improve. And so that's kind of what I do. I'm a science geek and like to go into scientific companies and try and help them improve whatever it is that they need to do, whether it's measurement or manufacturing of a scientific product, things like that. That's me.
Word up. And now I'd like to ask you, you touched on this earlier, was these two businesses. I don't know what we should do first. I got Botanacor and Agricor. I'll let you pick the adventure here.
Sure. So I'm going to step back and tell you how I got to meet these guys. I was running a division for a company called Charles River Labs, and I was out in South Carolina running this division. And Caleb will get to that because that's the horseshoe crabs and the blue blood and all that stuff. It's a very cool role. And I did go out there to help them do things. I know we'll get to it. We'll get to it. It was a very cool company, and they needed some help in the same way, kind of, science and business coming in all together. And I got finished up with that gig. I moved back to Colorado, and I wanted to see if what was going on in the cannabis space. So I got introduced to a couple of guys who owned a marijuana testing lab and a hemp testing lab. In Colorado, they have to be separate. You actually have to have separate entrances for them. They could be in the same building, but you cannot.
You knew some testing guys out there in Colorado.
Yeah.
All right. Let's circle back to that one later. And I apologize. I totally cut you off there, but yeah.
No, it was cool. So I started talking to these guys, and I talked to them from another perspective. So one of the other things I do is help owners gain liquidity of the companies that they've worked so hard to grow. Sometimes selling or liquidating in a good way a scientific company is a little different than a retail company or anything else. And so that's where I come in, and I've helped liquidity events happen for scientists in a whole bunch of different ways. But I wanted to see if cannabis was a place where I could make a mark and have some fun. So I met and was introduced to a couple of guys out here who had a hemp testing company, and a marijuana testing company. And they said, yes, Carl, we would love to, find an investor, sell off the company, whatever that is. They were ready to find liquidity for themselves. They weren't ready. The company needed to do some things to kind of get ready. So I spent the better part of a couple of years getting them ready for that opportunity to what we call take them out to the market. We run a controlled auction and look at who would be interested in buying their company. They get to select whoever it is they want. We advise them on that, and they did. And it was a lovely marriage and worked out very well for the owners. And then I stayed on. Well, I was running it for a couple of years prior, and then I stayed on for another year to run it for the company that bought them. And at the time, so the Farm Bill passed, the hemp Farm Bill passed in 2018,
18, yeah.
and hemp testing took off, which was interesting in and of itself. And so I ran those two labs. Now, look, it's cannabis, right? I mean, one of the plants does a really good job of moving the CBDA toward THCA, and the other one stays at CBDA. The one that stays at CBDA is called hemp, and the one that moves stuff toward THCA is called marijuana. So we use the same technology, the same test, the same everything, but we were testing hemp. And the things that people were interested in were slightly different, right? The hemp farmers wanted to make sure their Delta 9 level was below 0.3%.
Point
And
three. What a I'm sorry, I cut you off again, dude,
no,
but
do it, ask the
we're
question.
touching on this, and I thought that was just a ridiculous number. And I don't know where that number came from, but I'd sure like to find out and talk to whatever person proposed that.
Yeah, it it was, but they kind of the way most of this happens is they get a panel of experts, they sit around, they throw a bunch of stuff against the wall, and they come up with a number. They had to come up with something. So they came up with point 0.3. And probably the reason that they came up with point 0.3 was that at that level, yeah, think about it, at 0.3% Delta 9, you're not going to smoke this stuff.
Right,
At
but
least,
even at one, like I feel like one would have been a more reasonable, or two,
yeah.
for that exact reason you just mentioned. Like nobody's smoking 1% weed to get high. They're and some of the hemp farmers I've talked to here have told me that they had to stop growing some of their best cultivars because of that weird 0.3 limit. They're like, oh, our shit's testing at 0.8%. Like,
But here's where people throw out the worst of the worst, and this is why it ended up at below zero point 0.5, 0.3. So if you take those cultivars that are zero point 0.3 and I extract them and concentrate them down by a factor of 100, right? Zero point 0.3 becomes 30%. Now that's, and it will compete, as we're seeing now, it'll compete with the regulated marijuana industry.
hmm.
And so they were trying to keep the value low because if you concentrate it by 10 times, which is sort of realistic, then you only have 3%, right? Which is still going to be not in competition with regulated market. But if you said 2 and you concentrated it by 10 times, it's going to be 20%. So I think some of that thinking went into it, which all blew up anyway because, you know, people are just,
Hmm.
converting the CBDA into THCA and Delta 9 and Delta 8 and whatever they want at this point.
I do want to just sneak this other question in here, and I was trying to figure out what Shauna meant. Um, she dropped a couple other comments. THC content isn't something I use in my work. I never bat an eye at those numbers. I know some states want the higher THC total so they can charge higher taxes based on that percentage. And that's New York. They have the potency tax, which I think they're trying to repeal now. But then also followed up and said, do you think that's why the labs have a larger discrepancy with the results?
So, Shauna, thanks. Good questions. And I'll throw out what I know, and that is what I see here in Colorado, and California was the same way, and those were the places I did most of my stuff. It wasn't so much taxes because Colorado, there's no potency tax. It's not about that. It's I can get more money if it's 21% than if it's 18. So as a grower, I get more money, and at the dispensary, I can charge more. So it was really the economic argument at the retail level that was driving this. And to me, that's what's got to go away, because the end result of that is lab shopping, right? Because if I've got a flower that keeps testing out at 18%, they're telling me they're only going to give me this much for the bulk. If I can test it out at 21%, I'm getting a lot more money for my product. And so that's what caused a lot of the pressure to try and get these numbers to creep. And there are some very clever ways to do that. There was a lab here in Colorado that was doing it. They're no longer in business. But
What are what are the clever ways to do that?
all right. Um, so
Yeah,
this
Carl, let's
there
go.
no. All right. I just feel bad. Like it's like
It's
giving the
okay.
answer.
Look,
It's,
and I
it's
asked
like
some
giving
other
the answer to
people.
test.
Look, I asked some other people about this, including Scott Waring and Jeff Ross, two other PhD scientists. And I said, hey, if you're going to try to cheat these tests, how would you do it? Not to say you would cheat the test, but if you wanted to, or if you wanted to manipulate the results, like how would that go?
So one of the easiest ways to do it, when the flower comes into your shop, it's got 12, 15, 16% moisture, water, right? So if I dry that plant and now it's just dry and there's no water in there, I weigh it out, right? I get to weigh out. So if it's 1 gram that I have to weigh out, I'm weighing out 15% more flour than if I take it wet. And so immediately I'm going to bump your result by 15%, 12 to 15% if I dry it before I analyze. That's a really easy way to do it. And it's, I won't say it's hard to get caught, but kind of hard to get caught. And so that's how some people will bump the result. That's one. Two, a little more subtle is that I can calibrate my instrument to always be biased a little bit low, which means that it's going to give you a high biased result. It's all within spec, it's all good, right? I still passed my QC. When the state comes in and looks at me, I've passed my QC, but the results are always going to be on the high end. So those are things that labs can do if they intentionally want to drive the values up. Now, a good lab's not going to do that. A good lab is going to have a quality assurance organization that's going to look at that data and say, hey, wait a minute, your calibration standards are always tending low. We got to get them up to where they're trending to where they should be. And that eliminates that problem. But labs that are unscrupulous will have ways to get around that.
And, so I've talked to a bunch of labs around the country here who have told me, oh, we had like an MSO executive come in and say, hey, we'd like to use you as a lab, but everything's got to test over 27%, which is wild to me. It's like, that's not the way the lab transaction is supposed to go. You drop your flower off and you let the scientists do their science shit. It's not like you come in and make demands that, your mids are going to test over 27 or something. And that was wild to hear.
No, and part of it is, look, I mean, it's a tough industry right now, and people are paying for the potency, and so they're like, look, I can't sell this stuff if you don't get this kind of result for me, and there's a lot of pressure to do it. Which now I'm going to go back to something I said earlier. That's why California is saying everybody's got to do it the same way, because then there's no way to kind of cheat the system. Well, there will be ways to cheat the system, but the idea is to reduce the way to cheat the system. That's what they're trying to do.
There's always a way to cheat the system.
Yeah. But here, I'm going to throw this out, Caleb, because here's my latest harebrained idea, and I would love to bring this to the industry. As I said, there's a range, right? So rather than on the C of A saying that it's 21.3%, what if we said, here is my 95% confidence interval. So it's between 18.3 and 22.8. Now, when I look at the bud next to it, it's got a broad margin of, for its confidence interval, and they're going to overlap very significantly. Now people, rather than seeing that number 21 and seeing another one that's 18 and going, oh, I want to pay for the 21, which look, it's silly anyway. But that way, if they're seeing that there's all this overlap and there's a possibility that they're actually the same delta 9 potency, you start looking at the other things. Well, what does it taste like? How does it make me feel? Do I like it? Right? As opposed to just, oh, it's the highest number. That's what I want.
Well, that's what uh, that's how I judge weed. I never needed a number on there. Like, let me look at it, let me smell it, let me take a hit of it, and then I'll tell you if it's good.
Yeah. No, I agree. But there are a lot of people out there. Well, and think about it. They're charging based on the potency. So, you walk into a dispensary, you don't know a whole lot. You go, well, what's good? And the guy goes, well, here's the most expensive stuff because it's got a higher potency. And there you go.
So I got one more comment. Let me check the comments, and then she said exactly. Shauna, thanks for tuning in, and Shauna's coming on the show soon. I want to ask you about. I think we talked about this on the phone. Was pesticides, and when I hear you talk about the margin of error in these measurements, it makes me think about, okay, what about the margin of error in the pesticide measurements? If there's a 20% margin of error, and also I know there's pesticides people use that aren't even like regulated, and that's kind of stuff has always interested me. I don't know if you know anything about that, but it's uh, it's a concern to me personally.
Yeah, and I'll let me heighten the concern. I'm going to add to your uneasiness here just a little bit, and that is, yeah, I know. Um, so organic oranges. Let's just take oranges, right? So the FDA regulates over 300 pesticides for organic foods. Question number one: can organic foods have any pesticides on them? Well, of course not. Is the answer. No, they can, and they do. It's just that they have a list of pesticides that they cannot have, but there's a whole other list that they can have. So that's one thing. The other part is when organic, and I'll just use oranges, came out, um, and the whole organic movement started back in the late 90s, early 2000s. The FDA just laughed, and the reason was the following: the guys at the store who put all the oranges in the bins at the store were grabbing the ones with all kinds of pesticides on them, and then they go grab the organic ones and put them away. And the FDA actually tested for years and found that there was no difference between the organic and the non-organic in terms of pesticide levels because they all got smeared around. So that's another reason to worry. But here's the thing that bothers me more than anything else. Yes, organic oranges can have pesticides on them. And no, they don't test every batch or even close to every batch. So guess what? Hundreds of millions of oranges pass through every year that are not tested, that may have pesticides on them, and they call them organic. So here's the problem in the cannabis industry, right? This is what we face. We go to the store and we just believe that organic is better and it's good, and we buy them because we like them and we hear it's good. Have you ever seen a certificate of analysis for your orange and the pesticides on it? I haven't.
No.
Yeah. And so the reality is there's a lot back there that's hidden that we don't know, and we just believe it. In the cannabis industry, we're forced to learn what a certificate of analysis is. What does this data mean? And that's why it's unique. Like your milk. Shouldn't you ask to see what the microbiology is, the testing on your milk?
Do you want to talk about remediation? Because like pasteurization is another topic that has been constantly relayed to me as similar to some of the remediation techniques that are doing people are doing in the cannabis industry here.
Yeah, and what I would say, and I, as a scientist, if it's remediated and you can show me that there's no pesticide there, I'm good. I mean, I am good, right? Because What I'm worried about for me is whether the pesticide goes in me. Now, there may be a greater debate about, well, I don't want you using pesticides because they're bad for the land. They're bad for the animals that, are around and all that sort of stuff. And I get that. That's a reasonable argument, but it's slightly different. The one that I'm worried about is, hey, if I'm going to, crush up that weed and roll it in some papers, I don't want it to have any pesticides in it for me. For me.
Word up. And I'm going to just totally switch gears here because we're about at an hour. I'm going to just, here's another shameless slap. Craig, Corporate Advantage. Dr. Carl Craig. I'm going to keep calling you doctor. I like you scientists, man. You guys have taught me so much about not only the cannabis industry, but also, and I went to engineering school. I have a physics degree, but, I was better at writing papers than actually doing science. So, the other stuff I want to ask you about was what you touched on earlier was the crab blood. And that's the only note I have, but I remember we talked about that on the phone, and I'd really love to hear about that stuff.
Well, I will try and keep it brief because I know we're at time.
Dude, keep it long, man. I got you here, Carl. We set this up fucking 3 months ago or something. So take your time, man.
All right. So here's the deal. Medicine advances by learning things. And think about it. Back in the Dark Ages, they bled people to try and cure them or burned them to try and cure them. We didn't know what was going on. But there was a time in the early 20th century where they started to correlate that when you put something inside your body, and they used to put all kinds of stuff. They would inject wine in people to see what it would do. But when you inject it, yeah, I know, dude. Hey, look, they didn't know. They didn't know.
Hey, Chinese people used to eat mercury, right? Because they thought they would live forever, right?
Yeah, I mean, and bleeding people. Yeah. But we learn as we go, right? That's the part about science. So when we figured out that people would get sick from putting stuff in their body, and a lot of times it resulted in a fever and sometimes death, but they called it the fever response. And they wanted to figure out what it was, but they had no idea what it was. So they developed tests to determine if we would get a fever response by injecting something in us. And the way they tested that, and I'm sorry for the animal rights people here, but this is true.
Don't apologize on my show, Carl.
Okay. Well, what happened? They took New Zealand white rabbits. They put 3 of them together in a very tight cage so they couldn't move and get warm or change their temperature. And then they would put whatever they were going to put in people in the rabbits. So they would open up a little bit of their ear, inject some of the product into them. It would get into their blood system. And the reason they did 3 was if 2 of the 3 rabbits' temperatures went up by a certain amount, they said, oh, this will cause a fever response in people. They didn't know what it was, but it was going to cause a fever response. So they had to go back and you talk about remediate the drug or the product or whatever it was. So let's fast forward. They finally discovered what it was that was causing this. Gram-positive bacteria are the good bacteria that are in our gut, in our upper GI, lower GI system, and they're the ones we like. Gram-negative bacteria, staph, and so forth are the things that are bad. They cause infections. They're bad for us. They can cause septicemia, bacteremia. I mean, just all kinds of bad stuff, right? Gram-negative. Oh, well, then let's sterilize whatever we have, and then you'll be fine, right? So they did. They were like, oh, well, let's sterilize, kill all the bacteria, but they still saw these fever responses in the animals. Well, it turns out our body understands when a dead gram-negative bacteria is in there, the exoskeleton still looks kind of the same, and our body sees it, and it sees it as one of the worst predators we have, one of the worst pathogens we have, and it goes to town with um, an immune response, and it goes like crazy. Well, it's attacking something that's dead, and we don't know it, so it's going overtime to try and kill something that's already dead because it's not getting rid of it from the system, and you're not seeing a reduction in the result. Um, Dead gram-negative bacteria took on a name called endotoxin. So they are generally described as endotoxin. It could be any kind of dead gram-negative bacteria. It doesn't have to be a specific one. It's just a dead gram-negative bacteria. So let's imagine you got an IV solution that you're going to inject in somebody, and you plate it out to look for live bacteria, and nothing grows. You go, oh, cool, I'm going to put it in somebody. Well, no, wait, I got to check it with the rabbits. So you inject it in the rabbits, and the rabbits' temperature either goes up or down. Those rabbits could only do that a couple of times, and then actually they were put to death. So they were euthanized.
Oh,
I said I apologize to the animal access.
no, it's okay, dude. I have friends that did medical experiments on mice and rats, and I went to engineering school. I know how this goes. Yeah.
Well, and the thing is, for a lot of things, you still have to use animal models. The term is models.
You're not going to use a baby, right?
No. But when you can get away from it, you do. And so, about 70 years ago, a scientist out in Massachusetts was experimenting with different animals and injecting them with things that had this fever response to see how they respond. Maybe he was thinking we could go away from rabbits, use something else. I don't know. Maybe it was something smaller. I don't know exactly why he was doing the research. But he took a horseshoe crab. Horseshoe crabs are those big crabs on the East Coast that are prehistoric. They have little teeny legs. You can't eat them. They're terrible, I mean, in that regard. But they have been unevolved for millions and millions of years. You see them on the beach. They're laying upside down. There's a big program. Flip them over. Flip them over because they're good. They're not going to hurt you. They're good. Let's get them back out to sea. Well, this researcher had injected one of the horseshoe crabs, and it died. And he was like, "Oh my gosh!" So he threw it in the refrigerator. He was going to do a necroscopy the next day and figure out why it died. He went the next day, pulled it out of the refrigerator, and it was alive. He was like, "Wait a minute! I killed you, and you're alive. Like, what's going on?" So he ended up. He thought that was very interesting. He did a lot of research. Come to find out, now I'm going to cut a lot of time out of this. About 20 years went by. What he found out was that the crab's blood had a very unique affinity for gram-negative bacteria. Now, let me talk about the crab blood because it's interesting. I said that these crabs, these horseshoe crabs, are unevolved over millions of years. You and I have a couple hundred different cell types in our body: red blood cells, white blood cells. We got all these different cells. The horseshoe crab is one cell that does everything. It's one. They have all kinds of them, but it's one. It's the same cell. And their blood is blue. It's actually the same color. Put that back up. Put that back up.
Yeah, here we go. I'm with
that light blue color is the color of this crab's blood. All right, now you can take it down. Maybe like the shirt. So why is it blue?
Craig corporate advantage. Yeah.
Shameless. So why is it blue? Well, let's go to our blood. Our blood is red because the molecule that does all the work inside it is iron, right? Hemoglobin. You hear about all this. So it's iron based, so it is red, whereas these crabs, the metal that does all the work inside this one type of cell is copper. Now, if you've ever had your pipes leak and they're copper pipes, you see that blue color that gets precipitated out on your sink.
Huh.
Because it's copper, and copper is blue, not red. So the crab blood is blue. It's about that light blue color. And it turns out that it's very reactive, very, very intensely reactive to dead gram-negative bacteria. So what they did was over the years developed a test where they used the blood of the crab to detect for this fever response the endotoxin as opposed to injecting it in rabbits. Now the good news is the crabs don't die. You actually take blood from them like you and I are giving blood down at the blood bank, and then we put it back in the ocean.
Do you see that comment?
Oh, it,
That's from
listen,
Good People Gardens. That's why a gallon of horseshoe crab blood is 60K.
way more than that, my friend. Way, 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 way more than that. Um, the thing is, so the division I ran for Charles River Labs, we were the largest supplier of endotoxin tests globally. We did 100 million tests out in China. We did probably about 10 million tests throughout the rest of the world.
Wow.
And what we would do is every June, when they come into shore to mate, right after the mating season, we would collect them, bring them in. We called it Spa Day. It was pretty cool. They come in, we scrape the barnacles off of them, we clean them up, and then they give blood. So you poke them with a needle just like we get poked. Interestingly, the crabs only give as much blood as they want because they don't have a heart. Their system is pressure regulated. So when the pressure drops below a certain point, they stop giving blood. Some of them give a lot, some of them give a little. It's different. At any rate, then we take them back out to the ocean. We put them out, and off they go. We take that blood and refine it and turn it into um, more than $60,000 for a gallon. It's the tests are very, very um, the amount of crab blood used in a test is microliters, and a test is anywhere between $3 and $30. So think about that. I used 3 microliters of crab blood, and I charged $30 for it. So it's very lucrative. But here's the thing: we stopped um, euthanizing New Zealand white rabbits. They're not used anymore. They're very rarely used for anything at all. And so think about what we did. We went from, and it's not me, I was just working for the company that did. We went from euthanizing a lot of white rabbits to exsanguinating, a fancy term for taking blood from these horseshoe crabs, and turning that into a test that was more sensitive, easier to move around the world. I can ship that test to anybody, anywhere. And honestly, it was a lot cheaper. 3 rabbits doing that test was far more expensive than $3 or $30. Doesn't really matter. So it was fascinating. I'll throw one last thing out, which I think is pretty interesting, and that is, you think, I mean, so these crabs only exist in certain places, from sort of northern Georgia to Delaware on the United States East Coast, and in Vietnam, Malaysia, and on the southern China coast is where they live. Um, South Carolina, which and as backward a state as it is, I'll just leave it at that. Long ago, because they had these crabs, and the company that was using them to make these tests was in South Carolina. They lobbied the state government to protect them, and the government said they would. So the largest repository of these horseshoe crabs is now in off the shores of South Carolina. And in fact, we had a manufacturing plant over in Zhanjiang, China, that made a lot more tests than we did, but we had to ship them our blood because the Chinese killed off all their horseshoe crabs.
You had to ship crab blood to China?
Yeah, we were the cheap manufacturer in the United States to send it to China for them to make their tests.
Damn. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, it was a fascinating business. But again, um, it was a measurement of yes, no, I have this stuff in my solution. And so all the same principles that I talked about today applied in that very same industry. It's a comparison, it's an estimate.
That's nice that you circled it all the way back around there. Because
Well,
I'm
It's the core part of measuring anything in science. It really is. Like we would say, um, it was above a certain limit or below a certain limit. That's how endotoxin's done. But again, there's error in that. You've got to make sure you account for that error and so forth.
Well, it also brings to the uh, uh, begs the question, who's setting the limits for those measurements? Some of the legislators and regulatory agencies don't seem like they have a ton of experience in science, and maybe that I wonder if maybe they're unqualified to make those calls.
I think you're right. I think they are. And I do think, and certainly in the industries I've seen, the scientists try and get involved to say, here's what you ought to do. Um, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. Like I said, I mean, South Carolina protected the crabs because the scientists in our business went to them and said, look, these are very valuable and we want you to protect them. The only other thing that horseshoe crabs are used for currently in the United States is eel bait. They bring the crab, yeah, I know. They bring the crabs on shore. They have this thing that looks like a huge paper cutter. They basically cut them in half and then throw them in a cage, and they take them out offshore and fish for eels. Um, the Native Americans, I don't know.
Oh, yeah,
The
I
Native,
was not aware of that at all. That's a weird one there, Carl.
it
Huh.
is, and there are people who don't like that we were taking the blood of horseshoe crabs and putting them back in the water. And we would say, well, the only other option for them is get cut in half and used for eel bait. I think taking a little blood is better, and we protected them. But the other interesting thing about the crabs, and I'll leave it, is you know when Native Americans owned this country, um, they used to fish them and bring them up on land, and they would die, and then they would pulverize them for their organic content and calcium in the shells to fertilize their land.
Back when Native Americans owned the land, and we
Yeah,
didn't talk about social equity for them, but yeah,
that's not. Hey, that I'm a scientist, man. That's not my thing.
yeah,
I'm
cool.
no
So,
good.
Carl, I'm getting out of shit here. I want to pull up. I think I'm out of notes. I'd really like to first say here. I'm gonna pull myself back up. Hey, thanks for your time. I'm gonna do one more shameless slap here for Craig Corporate Advantage. Uh, Carl Craig here joining me tonight. I always leave a couple minutes here at the end if we missed anything that you think is super important, or if you have any shameless plugs, or shout outs that you want to give. Now is the time. Thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and I hope we can follow up on this again um, down the road. It's Carl Craig, Craig Corporate Advantage, dude. Thanks so much for joining me tonight.
Yeah, Caleb. No, it was great, and the reason we got together initially, this is what I'll throw out, is that I can be a little bit controversial, provocative, bringing science into where people don't like science to be. And so that's what got us started on the conversation. And so here's what I would say: I am totally available anytime somebody's got a question and wants to ping it off me and go, "Hey, what do you think of this?" I'm good. I'm an old guy with white hair, so I've got time, and I'm not going to charge you for answering stuff like that. But I love to spread positive information about what science really is, what measurement really is, and what it isn't. So if anybody is interested in that, Caleb, I'm more than happy to answer questions, emails, whatever, and try and help people understand this stuff.
That's all you got. I'm gonna sign it off right now.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Here, I'll make us both real big. And the guy who used to do my voiceovers for my last podcast. He did my signature tagline here, so I'm gonna let Durfee sign us off.
The devil's in the details, and the details are in the fine print.
Love it.
Good night, Carl. Thank you so much for being here with me. I'll post this shit all up tomorrow.
That's
Peace.
awesome. Thanks for having me, man.
Excellent.